This last section focuses on the Toulmin model. I have here the Rogerian method, but we have talked about that before. So the Toulmin model is a useful way of both analyzing and structuring an argument, created by British philosopher Stephen Toulmin. The Toulmin model is an effective tool in uncovering the assumptions that underlie arguments. Okay, some of the basic terms you need to know is a warrant, which expresses the assumption necessarily shared by the speaker and the audience. Similar to the minor premise of a syllogism, the assumption links the claim to the evidence. In other words, if the speaker and the audience do not share the same assumption regarding the claim, all the evidence in the world won't be enough to sway them. Backing consists of further assurances or data without which the assumption lacks authority. Basically, that's evidence to back up whatever the assumption is. The qualifier, when used, for example, usually, probably, maybe, in most cases, most likely, tempers the claim a bit, making it less absolute. Sometimes in arguments, you don't want to get caught talking in absolutes when your argument is basically based in probabilities, right? Because you leave yourself open to being proved wrong if you say something is absolute. In most cases, this is the situation. Whereas if you say all the time, this is the situation, then you might open yourself to, that one time that it doesn't apply, your whole theory falls apart. The reservation explains the terms and conditions necessitated by the qualifier. In many cases, the argument will contain a rebuttal that gives voice to objections. So some of the examples they give here is a Toulmin analysis will typically follow this form: because, evidence as support; therefore, just the claim; since, and here's the assumption, aka the warrant; on account of, and that's the backing, the evidence that backs up the assumption; unless, and then here's the reservation. Here's, as we can see here, that sometimes it gives rise to the idea that only in certain circumstances is your claim true. So they give this example here and a whole diagram. Hopefully you read through this. Okay, notice here in this statement, because it is raining, therefore I should take my umbrella since it will keep me dry. The assumption is that an umbrella will keep you dry. Now, obviously, in this example, I think we all can agree that normally an umbrella will keep you dry. But notice that with a lot of other arguments, there are assumptions that are like this that people take for granted. Again, this is a silly example, but let's say there's some people who don't agree that an umbrella keeps you dry. They may say, well, some umbrellas aren't very good. Some umbrellas don't cover your entire body. Therefore, I don't agree that umbrellas keep you dry. Well, if that person is out there that has that assumption, and let's say there's a lot of people that have that assumption, then in the rest of your argument, you're going to have to do a better job of addressing that. Because then if you just kind of leave it there, then people are not going to agree with you. Again, because they're not agreeing with your warrant. They're not agreeing with your assumption. Okay, here's a more fully expressed Toulmin model. Okay, analyzing assumptions. Toulmin model shows us that assumptions are the link between a claim and the evidence used to support it. And really, we should say assumptions here because arguments of any complexity are always based on multiple assumptions. If your audience shares those assumptions, it is more likely to agree with the claim, as we mentioned before with the umbrella example. Finding the argument to be sound. If your audience does not share those assumptions, then the assumption becomes yet another claim requiring evidence. So again, it all comes back to when you're analyzing an argument, if the arguer is giving you certain claims and not addressing the assumptions behind those claims, they're not really doing a good job of covering all the angles of their argument. Same thing when you are writing your own argument. Be aware of the assumptions that your claims are, or the assumptions that underlie your claims. Okay, hopefully you read some of these examples here. Okay, now this activity, let's look at some of the assumptions that underlie each statement. So grades should be abolished because they add stress to the learning experience. Well, the assumption here is that stress is always bad. Sometimes stress could be a good thing. Sometimes stress can motivate someone to accomplish something, right? Until you buy me a diamond, I won't know you love me. The assumption there is diamonds are the only way to show someone love. Everyone should read novels because they make us more understanding of human foibles and frailties. Assumption there that novels are the only way to understand these human elements. right? There might be other ways of understanding these aspects of human nature, but this statement is just kind of a specific. It's always novels. Everyone should read it. If you want to decrease gang violence, we should legalize drugs. The assumption there is gang violence is exclusively tied to drugs and not other issues. If you legalize drugs, that doesn't necessarily mean gang violence is going to go away. There might be a million other factors as to why gang violence is a thing that have nothing to do with drugs. Drugs may be one factor, but it's not the only one. So here you would have to address that assumption. You would have to explain why drugs would be the sole reason why gang violence would be reduced if they were legalized. And you have to address what are the potential other reasons why gang violence is a thing and how would you address those. Don't get married if you believe that familiarity breeds contempt. The assumption here is that familiarity is always bad. Just because you are close to someone and see them every day doesn't necessarily mean that's going to lead to bad things. Wi-Fi should be available to everyone without cost because the internet has become a vital part of our lives. The assumption here is that the internet is vital to our lives. I guess in a way, this is pretty obvious that this is something that most people would agree with, that the internet is pretty important. I guess maybe another assumption here would be that it should be available without cost. Like, why should it be free? Is the internet a right or is it a privilege? If the person you're arguing to thinks that the internet is a right, then therefore they would agree with this assumption that it should come free. Or if someone has the assumption that the internet is a privilege that not everyone necessarily should have access to, you should have to earn it by paying for it, then they're not going to follow you with this assumption. Here you must obey her because she is your mother. That assumes that the sole reason you should listen to your parent is just because they happen to be your mother. Maybe there are more reasons. Maybe they're credible. Maybe they're a good person. Maybe they've done a lot for you. But just for the mere fact that they're your parent doesn't necessarily mean you have to listen to everything they say. And then this last one, because improving the educational system in this country is essential to competing with the other industrialized nations, we need to equip all classrooms with the latest computer technology. This assumes that current technology is the sole way we can improve our education system. Okay. This one here, hopefully you were able to read through this speech and see some of the different elements of argument. Here we see our introduction, just like in the classical oration. Here we see some more of the introduction, but notice it's spread out over a number of paragraphs. Okay, here's the beginning of the narration, more background knowledge. Okay, here's where we talk about induction. Okay, here are the particulars from the past. There's all these different examples of religious freedom being taken away and why that was bad. So all these particulars, all leading to the universal claim that the government has no right to deny houses of worship or any religious group. Again, this is somewhat of a generalization, right? We don't know this for sure. It's more of an opinion, right? Therefore, it's more induction. Okay, here we see the end of narration, beginning of the confirmation section. If we scroll up a little more, we see this is their thesis. I think this I just highlighted. Okay, deduction, the universal truth that the government does not have the right to deny religious freedom, applied to this specific case of the mosque being constructed in NYC. The refutation, or the acknowledge the other side. It's not super clear, but it's kind of like providing a caveat. Some more of the conclusion. And then if we apply the Toulmin model, which I thought I had here, but apparently I don't. But hopefully the rest of what what happened to this was here. Okay. Well, anyway, let's speaking of the Toulmin model, let's look at some more information that I think is important to think about. Okay, so there is some different terminology that sometimes is used, right? Instead of, let's see, they have here the evidence, they call it here the claim. I mean, it's similar concept. So the claim or the grounds and the warrant is the assumption that lies in between. Okay, for example, if you argue that there are dogs nearby, you hear barking and howling in the distance. So your claim is there are dogs nearby. So the assumption is dogs are animals that bark and howl. This is a pretty obvious assumption that we would all agree to. Okay, let's look at the grounds here. In their paper, this scientist Cummings et al. Discuss how email communication are an inferior means of maintaining personal relationships. However, their study does not account for technological, demographic, or modality limitations. So that leads to the claim additional research on computer-mediated communication needs to be conducted to better understand how online interactions affect relationships. So the underlying assumption here is when a paper lacks a certain perspective, as it says here, more research would be beneficial to prove its claims. I think this is, again, an underlying assumption that I think we would all agree to, but if it was an assumption that maybe is questionable, then you would want to address that in the rest of your paper. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about in relation to the warrant. As we see, a warrant is an unstated or stated belief, rule, or principle that underlies an argument, is a concept called an enthymeme. An enthymeme in logic is basically a syllogistic argument that is incompletely stated. So if I were to say the argument, all insects have 6 legs, therefore all wasps have 6 legs, I'm missing a premise, right? That all wasps are insects. Okay, this missed premise, something that is incomplete, an argument that is incomplete, is called an enthymeme. So let's look at some examples. An enthymeme would be after-school jobs are bad for teenagers because they take away study time. So this includes a claim. Here's the claim with a reason, but there's an unstated assumption, and that's the warrant, and that's loss of study time is bad. So a better way to say this would be all after-school jobs are bad for teenagers because they take away study time, and study time is really important. Saying that last part about how study time is really important, that's how you would make this argument complete. Enthymeme, we should buy this used Volvo because it is very safe. The claim is we should buy this used Volvo. The stated reason, it is very safe. The underlying assumption that's missing here is that safety is the most important reason to buy a car. Maybe there's a lot of other reasons why you would buy a car. You would want to address that. And then this last argument, we cannot trust this man for he has perjured himself in the past. In this enthymeme, the major premise of the complete syllogism is missing. Those who perjure themselves, perjure means lie, cannot be trusted. This man has perjured himself in the past, and therefore he cannot be trusted. Right? Notice how in this statement, we're missing the major premise. Therefore, it's an enthymeme. And then the underlying assumption here is someone who has lied in the past is not to be trusted. So the main point of the Toulmin model and why it's important and why you should think about it is always think about the underlying assumptions to an argument that you're reading or that you're making, and don't just assume your readers are going to go with you on that. You might want to address those underlying assumptions to strengthen your argument. Same goes when you're reading an argument. If they're just kind of telling you something without stating certain things, as we can see in these examples, then you're going to want them to address those things. And if they don't, then that may lead you to not believe their entire argument.